Do not let anyone suggest Plato to me. In regard to Plato, I am a thorough skeptic. You might have come across a famous quote on the internet in which Nietzsche calls Plato boring. This is obviously a provocation on Nietzsche's part, considering the influence Plato's had on Western philosophy, but that doesn't mean he just blurted it out without reason. Nietzsche has a very specific bone to pick with Plato. Plato's theory of forms, broadly speaking, holds that the physical, material world is only an ephemeral, imperfect reflection of a truer, timeless world of forms or ideas. These ideas are the essence of things. For example, there are many cups in the world, but they all share the same essence. They all participate in the idea of cupness. The ideal cup exists somewhere as a Platonic idea or form. Without this idea, we couldn't call a cup, well, a cup. In Platonism, the material world is imperfect compared to the world of ideas. A geometrical example can make things clearer. Imagine a circle. It's impossible to draw a mathematically perfect circle in the real world. The perfect circle exists only as an idea, as a concept. But that doesn't mean we can't draw circles at all. The theory of forms tries to explain why we recognize this imperfect circular shape as a circle. It's because the drawing participates in the idea of the circle. It shares its essence. So there is the imperfect material world and there is the perfect world of forms. Should we focus our philosophical efforts on the imperfect world or on the perfect world? The answer is obvious. The task of the philosopher is to contemplate the Platonic ideas. Because, it's important to mention, the world of forms is not simply a catalog of objects, it's a catalog of values as well. For example, how do we know if something is beautiful? When it participates in the idea of beauty. The same goes for justice, truth, and the good. There exist in the world of forms perfect ideas of the good, the true, the just, and the beautiful. We can recognize the essence of these ideas in our material world, and when we do so, we can call things good, true, just, or beautiful. In the words of Nietzsche, the concept good is already the highest value with him. And you can see how these ideas can transform over time into Christianity. The Platonic world of forms becomes the kingdom of God or heaven. It's the same underlying idea that the material world is imperfect, but that there exists a spiritual world of perfection someplace else, on a metaphysical level. Of course, we are painting with a very broad brush here, and in this analysis, a lot of nuance gets lost. But this is the basic gist of Nietzsche's point, and it is magnificently worded in one of the most famous quotes: Christianity is Platonism for the people. So let's zoom out a little bit and look at the essential element of Platonism and Christianity. There is the idea that the material world is inferior to some kind of metaphysical beyond world, which may or may not be accessible to us. Nietzsche is heavily opposed to this notion. He dismisses the idea that there exists some kind of metaphysical world beyond the material world we inhabit day to day. This is perhaps the most persistent error in all of philosophy, where Nietzsche is concerned at least. This is the idea of the Hinterwelt, and it takes many forms. It's the world of ideas in Plato, heaven in Christianity, the thing in itself in Kant, and the will in Schopenhauer. These proposed metaphysics are different in detail but not in essence. For Nietzsche, they are all different instantiations of the Hinterwelt, a beyond world that is somehow more perfect or more everlasting than the material world. This notion of the Hinterwelt began with Plato and survived up until Nietzsche's day, and depending on who you ask, it still persists today. We've done a more detailed video on how Nietzsche traces the idea of the Hinterwelt in its many forms throughout the history of philosophy. There's a link in the description if you're interested. But Nietzsche's problem with Plato doesn't stop at a simple disagreement on metaphysics. For Nietzsche, there is a psychological component to the Hinterwelt. The Hinterwelt, in Nietzsche's psychological analysis, is exposed as a refuge for the weak. They construct this imaginary artificial world to hide from the real material world in which they're not faring too well. We explore this more deeply in our 1 hour long analysis of Nietzsche's work on the genealogy of morals. Again, link in the description. In that work, Nietzsche argues that in the struggle for power, the strong win from the weak. The weak, in turn, need to find a psychological mechanism to cope with this position of inferiority. One such coping mechanism is the construction of an imaginary world which allows them to escape the real world. The emergence of these kind of Hinterwelt philosophies is for Nietzsche the chief symptom of decadence, the sign of an unhealthy culture. We cannot fully explain the ramifications or meaning of these loaded terms in a short video like this. If you're interested, you can check out our videos on the genealogy of morals and twilight of the idols. But this gets to the meat of the matter. Plato, for Nietzsche, represents the first signs of decay of the ancient Greek culture of Hellenism. The pre-Socratics, the so-called nature philosophers, engaged with the world as it was given to them. With Socrates and Plato, this project comes to an end. Instead of having a focus on the material world, philosophy now shifts its attention to this imaginary world of forms. Psychologically, for Nietzsche, this is a sign of cowardice and incapability of engaging with the material world. Plato is a coward in the face of reality. Consequently, he takes refuge in the ideal. He will accuse Christians and Schopenhauer of the same thing. In fact, he argues that Platonism served as a bridge between the old noble culture of ancient Greece and Christianity. In the great fatality of Christianity, Plato is that double-faced fascination called the ideal, which made it possible for the more noble natures of antiquity to misunderstand themselves and to tread the bridge which led them to the cross. This misunderstanding was only possible because the Greeks had become sick, decadent, in other words, ripe for philosophy. The philosophers are, of course, the decadence of Hellas, the counter-movement directed against the old and noble taste. Socratic virtues were preached to the Greeks because the Greeks had lost virtue. Irritable, cowardly, unsteady, and all turned to play actors, they had more than sufficient reason to submit to having morality preached to them. This, in conclusion, is Nietzsche's main problem with Plato. Plato was the first preacher of the Hinterwelt, an erroneous idea that persisted for millennia, which Nietzsche exposed as a symptom of sickness and decadence, of a weakening of the culture instead of the philosophical progress of a culture. Nietzsche's entire philosophy, in a way, boils down to an attempted destruction of this idea and the metaphysics and morality which it brings forth. In doing so, he is effectively taking on the entire philosophical tradition from Plato onward, including all of Christianity and German idealism, which includes Kant and Schopenhauer. But we're not done with Plato just yet. Nietzsche has a few words to say about Plato's style. I have never been able to agree to the admiration of Plato the artist, which is traditional among scholars. In my opinion, Plato bundles all the forms of style pell-mell together. In this respect, he is one of the first decadents of style. As Nietzsche graciously admits, this is just his opinion. It's asserted without real argument, and it can therefore be dismissed without argument. You could even accuse him of being biased. A more substantive critique of his style concerns the Socratic dialogue which Plato employs in his writings. This is a common critique of Plato. Generally, he presents his arguments in the form of a dialogue between Socrates and some other Greek figure, commonly a sophist, who serves as the foil. Socrates asks him questions, the foil replies, and Socrates responds. Of course, the conclusion is always that Socrates is right and his conversation partner is wrong. But that's easy. Plato wrote both parts of the conversation. Of course, he can make Socrates look smart and the opponent look dumb. The dialogues are presented as a fair fight when in reality they're simply rhetorical tools. They're composed so Plato can get his point across. For this reason, Plato has often been accused of straw-manning his opponents. For Nietzsche, this way of getting points across is simply childish. For the Platonic dialogue, this revoltingly self-complacent and childish kind of dialectics, to exercise any charm over you, you must never have read any good French authors. Fontenelle, for instance. This contrast with Fontenelle is interesting. Bernard Le Bouvier de Fontenelle was a 17th century author who was famous for writing accessible works of science, most notably about the theory that the Earth revolves around the Sun, which was still new at the time. His most famous work, Conversations on the Plurality of Worlds, takes the form of a conversation between a philosopher and an aristocratic lady. Through a series of dialogues, he explains to the lady the latest scientific discoveries and theories, including heliocentrism and the idea that every star might have its own solar system, just like our own sun. The philosopher even advances the possibility of these solar systems harboring alien life. In all likelihood, Nietzsche singled out this dialogue of Fontenelle to contrast with Plato's dialogues for one major reason. Fontenelle writes in a singular style. He warns the reader in the prologue that he will be very to the point. Before I recount our various conversations, perhaps you may expect some description of the scene, some picture of the romantic country under whose shades the Marchioness is enjoying the autumn. If so, you will be disappointed. So many people have exercised their talents on this amusing species of writing that I shall dispense with the ceremony. This is in stark contrast to Plato's style, which is full of descriptions of scenery, which, to be fair, comes with high praise in the tradition and from scholars, but not from Nietzsche. I'll leave you with one final remark Nietzsche made on Plato. I would prefer to designate the whole phenomenon Plato with the hard word superior bunkum. Humanity has had to pay dearly for the Athenian. Do you agree with his assessment of Plato, stylistically as well as philosophically? Let us know in the comments. Hopefully, we can get some good discussion going. I want to thank our loyal patrons who make long videos like these possible. Remember that if you pledge $10 per month or more, you can get access to a monthly Patreon exclusive video which is not shown anywhere else. 2 videos have been released so far, which translates to about half an hour of exclusive material. Check out our Patreon page if you want to support the channel and if you want to have access to these videos. And if you want more Nietzsche, we got you covered as well. This discussion centered mostly on a few paragraphs in Twilight of the Idols, but we've done an analysis on the entire book as well. Check it out or watch our video on how Nietzsche took on the world. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.